In this video, and the videos after this one, I'll be explaining the subjunctive in Spanish, which is the last most difficult concept, ending all of my topics in Spanish. Typically, it's a concept that students learn in intermediate Spanish before learning the future tenses. However, I decided to keep it until the end because of its difficulty, and after I'm done with it, I'll compile all of my Spanish videos into one long video that has every Spanish principle. The reason why the subjunctive is so hard is because it has a lot of variations, more than any other tense in Spanish, that I've shown on this channel. Unlike the past tense, which has 3, and the future tense, which has a couple, the subjunctive has a total of 4 variations that need to be shown individually. In this video, I'll only explain the principles of the subjunctive, and in the videos after this one, I'll explain each topic individually. Before learning how to make sentences in the subjunctive, we need to understand its formation and the variations that it has. As far as I know, in the subjunctive, there are only 4 ways that it can change. There is the present subjunctive, the past subjunctive, the present perfect subjunctive, and the past perfect subjunctive. There also used to be a future subjunctive in Spanish, which is now obsolete and being replaced by the present subjunctive. Overall, just know that these are the variations of the subjunctive. I already made videos about the present and the past in Spanish, and so some concepts are more useful than others. However, after this video, I'll explain each tense separately because there's a lot to know. In this video, I will not focus on any of these tenses because I'll just explain how the subjunctive works in general by presenting its fundamentals. You might have heard some teachers explaining the subjunctive as a mood that expresses the speaker's attitude towards events, actions, and states that are uncertain or hypothetical. Despite other educators explaining the subjunctive differently, I do not like any of these explanations because they tend to confuse students rather than make them understand the subject matter properly. I recommend that all of you ignore these definitions because my definition of the subjunctive is far simpler, but keep in mind that this explanation makes perfect sense to me. I apologize if it doesn't make sense to you, but it should help you understand the subjunctive better. The easiest way to spot a subjunctive sentence is through this construction: subject verb plus that plus subject verb. In Spanish, the phrase will be subject verb plus que plus subject verb. This is the type of phrase that you will see all the time, which activates the subjunctive, meaning that a sentence can start with any subject and any verb and continue with any subject and any verb aside from vosotros. However, this is where we need to pay close attention to the details in order to fully understand what activates the subjunctive and what doesn't. Just because a sentence has a subject verb plus que plus a subject and a verb, it does not mean that the phrase will be in the subjunctive, mainly because we have to pay close attention to the first verb in the sentence. In order to have a sentence that is activated in the subjunctive, the first verb in the sentence, conjugated with its pronoun, must be a verb of will, emotion, influence, recommendation, or doubt, disbelief, and denial. A simple way to remember this is by using the word weird. The initial letter of every category combines into the word weird, so you must have a verb that comes from this list. If a verb does not come from weird, the subjunctive is not activated. And here's what I mean. We can have a sentence like, I believe that you ate, which in Spanish would be, yo creo que tú comiste. In this case, the phrase is not in the subjunctive because the verb creer doesn't come from weird. It's simply a verb that expresses an opinion. Not to mention that the second verb in the phrase is conjugated properly. Therefore, it's not in the subjunctive. Similarly, we can say, I know that you ate, which would be, yo sé que tú comiste. This sentence also doesn't activate the subjunctive because saber means to know factually, and therefore, it does not come from weird. In these cases, you have to find verbs that activate the subjunctive, and these have to be verbs of will, emotion, influence, recommendation, or doubt, disbelief, and denial. Based on my experience in Spanish, these are the most common verbs that activate the subjunctive, which means that they can begin with literally any subject in Spanish. Obviously, I'm not including every verb on the list, but these are the most common verbs used to express the subjunctive. If you see a sentence starting with any of these verbs and with any subject, the sentence will be in the subjunctive. If you see a sentence that doesn't start with any of these verbs or from verbs that don't come from weird, it will not be in the subjunctive. That's the first thing you should know about the subjunctive in Spanish. The second thing you should know about the subjunctive is something that is related to the construction subject verb que subject verb. In this typical phrase, the second verb must be modified in the most irregular way possible, especially in the present and past subjunctive. Considering that the first verb comes from weird, which activates the subjunctive, the second verb in the sentence has to change in a completely different way, unlike any other way that I've shown on this channel. However, I will not present this way in this video. I'll present it in the videos after this one, considering that there are 4 tenses of the subjunctive to begin with. Additionally, this part of the phrase can literally consist of any subject and any verb. Considering that I said that the second verb has to get modified in the most irregular way, this means that you will have to not only memorize every conjugation of every verb, but you will also have to understand how stem changing and irregular verbs are used in the second part of the phrase. Within every tense, the pattern completely changes in the present subjunctive, which is different from the past subjunctive, and so on. This is what makes the subjunctive the most difficult concept in Spanish. Considering that you have a subjunctive phrase, mainly consisting of a subject verb que, subject verb, the second part of the phrase phrase can literally begin with any subject and any verb that has to not only correspond to the subject, but also be modified in a completely different way. If you think about it, then you have stem changing, irregular yo verbs, and irregular verbs in general, and on top of all of that, you have 4 tenses that change each verb in a different way. I apologize if it sounds too confusing, but that's the best way that I can describe the subjunctive. There are no examples in this video because I'm simply going over the principles of the subjunctive, but I will provide many useful phrases in the videos after this one, mainly consisting of one useful verb from each category of weird. Moreover, there's a third concept you should know in the subjunctive, and that is separate phrases that can still activate the subjunctive, which is different than subject-verb que, subject-verb. Like I said previously, just because the phrase begins with a subject-verb que, subject-verb, it doesn't automatically mean that the phrase is subjunctive. Sometimes we can have phrases that begin with a main clause and end with a subordinate clause in order to indicate what activates the subjunctive. And these phrases can be es necesario que plus subject-verb, es importante que plus subject-verb, and so on. Obviously, there are more sentences that activate the subjunctive using other expressions, conjunctions, and even adjective clauses, but I will not talk about them in this video and future videos because it's simply too excessive and impractical. What you should know are the most utilized expressions in the subjunctive, just to understand how the subjunctive functions, and of course, there are sentences similar to these expressions that do not activate the subjunctive, like it's a fact that you ate. Es un hecho que tú comiste. This sentence looks like it's going to activate the subjunctive, but it's really not. So make sure that you watch out for these ideas. And so finally, this is everything you should know and understand about the subjunctive in Spanish. And this is why it's the most difficult concept in Spanish. At first, in order to activate the subjunctive, you need to have a sentence that has a subject-verb que, subject-verb, or a general main clause that supports a subordinate clause like es necesario que, subject-verb. Secondly, if you were to use the first construction, then the first verb in the sentence would have to be a verb of will, emotion, influence, recommendation, or doubt, disbelief, and denial, also known as weird. If a verb does not come from weird, the subjunctive is not activated. However, if it is activated, the second verb of the sentence absolutely must be modified in the oddest way possible, depending on the tense that you want to utilize. The second part of either phrase can consist of literally any subject and any verb, and the verb must be conjugated the proper way depending on the subject and the tense, whether it's in the present, past, present perfect, or past perfect. To recap what I've just said, this is the reason why the subjunctive in Spanish is the most difficult concept, hands down. It has 4 tenses, it must have a verb coming from weird or a general main clause, the second part can consist of any subject and any verb, and the second verb has to get conjugated depending on the tense. This is everything that you should know about the subjunctive in Spanish. And in the videos after this one, I'll go in depth and explain each variation as easily as I can, in order to make your learning as easy as possible.